Hi, everyone, and welcome to a special simulcast of the Neil Haley Show and the Limitless Podcast with our host, Tracy Poizner. Tracy, how are you? And I know you're really excited about us co-hosting together, and you have an amazing guest for us today.
I do, and I'm so excited and honored to welcome Gerald Pollack, who is professor of bioengineering at the University of Washington in Seattle. He's the author of several very well received books, one of which I'm holding in my hands and really just finished reading the other day. And you can see it's like full of sticky notes, and I basically ran out my yellow highlighter in there because it was so exciting to read. So thank you for being here today. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Tracy. Good to be with you, and I'm looking forward to trying to answer your question.
I'm I have to say I've become suddenly a science geek. This was so interesting for me to read, not just because I'm a homeopath and have been one for 25 years. So you are a very significant personage in my professional world. I've known about you for a long time. Your discoveries and your theories are extremely relevant in that world. But I was very pleased and surprised to discover how reader friendly your book was, how it's a page turner. I couldn't put it down. I was not expecting that. I thought it was going to be dry and academic, and it just isn't at all.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I spend a lot of time editing. We can sit down at the keyboard and write something, and then my own experience is that if I let it sit and revisit 2 months later, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. Absolutely rewritten several times. I strive to connect because my own view is that science is actually very simple. It's not complicated the way it appears to be today. If you're into the truth is really very simple. And I hope that we're into the truth, and therefore it should be expressible in straightforward terms that even a middle school student can understand, or a high school student. So that's what I try
Yeah.
to do. And the books take time as a result. Next book should be sent to the printer in a matter of a week or so. And I'm hoping that the verbiage will be similar. I'm really excited about it.
Can you tell me a little what's the next one about?
It's called Charged, and it deals with, well, the unexpected role of electrical charge in nature. And it deals with what we see every day. I'm looking out my window now and I see the clouds and Seattle, typical Seattle weather, wintertime weather, cloudy. But nobody understands exactly how weather works. You hear the weather forecasters who sound like they really know what they're talking about, but if you try to look and find an explanation for weather that starts with fundamental principles and winds up with explanations of hurricanes, tornadoes, and the like, you can't find it because it's not clear at all. I spent 4 chapters of my 19 chapter book on that. I also speak about gravitation. We think we understand gravitation. One mass
Mm.
pulls another mass, but there are a bunch of exceptions to the rule. And those exceptions, they're called anomalies. And usually they're swept under the carpet. Oh, someone will figure out how they actually fit into the scheme of things, that the scheme that we know must be true. Uh, and when a number reaches some critical value, you got to scratch your head and think, is this really true? So I spend a few chapters dealing with what I think gravitation is all about, which is not so different from what's accepted, but it's different enough. And I deal with how planes fly and how birds fly. So you'd think everybody knows how planes fly, right?
Yeah.
Except they do crash every now and then. And if I were to ask you how planes fly, you say you're not a scientist, but maybe you've heard of Bernoulli's principle.
That's one that I know. It
Yeah,
happens to be
okay.
one that I know.
You might be surprised in Scientific American about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago, there was an article in Scientific American. It's not such a radical journal. They take what everybody believes is true and tries to explain it in a way that appeals to the average reader. There was one, it's called, I think it was called How Planes Fly. And the subtitle underneath in smaller font italics was, despite years of research, we still don't understand how planes fly. And this was written not by you or me, it was written by the two people who are the experts in understanding the mechanics and dynamics of flight, world's experts. And the world's experts are saying, we don't really know how planes fly. So it's weird. I agree with him. We don't know how planes fly. And I put forth some ideas about how planes fly and actually how birds fly. You think if I were to ask you how birds fly, you'd probably say, oh, they flap their
They
wings.
flap their wings.
Some birds don't flap their wings,
Yeah.
So it's the, what's it called? The black raven. Not raven, black crow? No. Oh, sorry. The white crow. I read about this recently. If you think all crows are black, you just need one white crow
Yeah.
to dispel the notion that all crows
Yeah.
are black. So it's the same sort of thing. If you see birds that are flying without flapping their wings, then wing flapping cannot be the critical answer. And I see out my window, I'm at home right now, and I overlook a lake and mountains. It's really quite nice. And every morning I see eagles flying. There's a nest nearby, and occasionally they flap their wings, but mostly they don't flap their wings. And they'll so-called soar, and they'll go into the wind, against the wind, right angles to the wind. They'll go down, they'll go level, and they'll go up also. Every day this happens. And, it needs explanation. So I think, without revealing at least what I think, because that's maybe reserved for the book, I
Yeah.
think the understanding of flight is different. And since you asked me, the last chapter, besides the conclusion chapter, deals with sailboats. I do sail by any chance?
I
Oh,
don't sail. I have been in a sailboat, but I can't call myself a sailor by any means.
why not?
I was a
Uh,
passenger.
okay, you're a passenger. So when the wind is blowing, sailing downwind, it's easy to understand because the wind
Right.
fills the sail and down you go. But the boat can also go
Yeah.
upwind, and it can go upwind, typically, probably in the boat that in which you were sailing, down up to 45 degrees or so
Yeah.
off the wind. And racing boats can go up to 30 degrees off the wind. And there's a certain kind of boat that can go 5 degrees off the wind.
Oh,
Imagine, so you're basically sailing into the wind. And those are ice boats. Ice boats are common in cold climates, and they look like a regular sailboat, but they're not in the water. They're on skids, and
right. On skates. Yeah.
on skates. They travel on the ice, and they go typically like 100 miles an hour. You have to pray that
Yeah.
you're going to make it, and the wind is always on your face because you're going into the wind. But that doesn't make any sense, right? Because if I blow on you, on your face with a strong wind, you're going to go back, not
Yeah.
forward. But they go forward. So explain it. So
So
there's
that
something,
has to have something to do in your whatever you're explaining in the rest of your book. That has to have something to do with flying, with the way
yes,
the air is going
yeah.
over the wing and doing the
Well,
opposite of what you think.
yeah, all of these things have to do with electrical charge.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
Wow.
About
Now, you know what's interesting, Tracy, is with Dr. Pollack, what he's able to uncover in all this is that science is about investigation. Everyone thinks science has to be fact and it can never be changed. And that's the mistake we make because part of that scientific inquiry is to investigate things that have already become science and see if there are other ways of figuring things out.
That's what
Science,
science is supposed to be about, right?
it
Right.
is. And they mostly don't like, it's rare to encounter someone as yourself who is a scientist who loves to say, what what is the sacred cow that I should be investigating here? What do I believe is true that might be wrong, that would change everything? People
Yeah,
don't like to do that.
it's not that they don't like to. I think they do like to, but they're inhibited from doing so.
Mm,
And the reason they're inhibited has to do with the way science is funded. Today, in
yeah.
order to do science, you need money. Okay. And I give you an example of the kind of impediment that exists against revolutionary science. And that is it's the system, the grant system, how the grant
Mm.
system works. So let's say you, Tracy, you you know that everybody around you thinks the earth is flat. Okay, let's say, suppose. And I can see, I look out the window at Lake Washington and it looks flat. Not much wind today. It's really flat. No curvature whatsoever. And so you think, and the world thinks that the earth is flat, but you come upon some evidence that might not be flat. You've looked and you've seen some satellite images showing the earth, and it is a kind of curvature that you can see. And you've also looked at photos taken from the moon, and you can see the earth is in its beautiful blue splendor. It looks like a coin. So it looks like it's round. And you think, well, heavens, Betsy, this is really important stuff. And I actually want to study this. I don't want to just let it go. So you decide you need money to do it because you got to hire some people and you need equipment and supplies and all this stuff. So you decide to prepare a grant proposal. You prepare it assiduously over a period of a couple of months because these grant proposals have to be meaty. They have to censor them. And you deposit it at the entrance to the National Science Foundation. And the gatekeeper looks at it and sees Tracy Poizner. Who on earth is that? I never heard of her. And by golly, she's proposing something so revolutionary. I better do my job and hire some experts to find out whether she's for real or she's a flake.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on there. So who do they hire? They hire the experts. And who are the experts? They're the experts in flat Earth. So you're putting in a proposal and it's your challenger who's reviewing your proposal and decides whether you get funded.
Right.
Okay.
And then you're not going to get funded unless you believe in their point of view.
Yeah, exactly. Who wants to be challenged, especially if it looks like a genuine challenge? If it's flaky, who cares? But if it's a real challenge, you're not going to get your money. And so scientists know, even though many scientists have not lost their curiosity, but a lot of scientists know that it's just a waste of time to put in the proposal for something that challenges the status quo. And that's the reason why, if I were to ask you, can you name a scientific or a handful of scientific revolutions that have occurred the past, say, 50 years that have really impacted you? I'm not talking about technological revolutions like Zoom, iPhone. I'm talking about something like a splitting of the atom or the genetic code, which I think was 75 years ago and 65 years ago, or something like that. Those were real, genuine scientific revolutions. They completely changed what we've thought, and they've changed our lives. Can you name a handful of those that have taken place during the past half century? And I think you'd be at a loss to think of some people. A few people have responded with, "Oh, the Higgs boson," which sounds like a new dance or something like that. But how has that affected your life? It's a little blip on a computer screen that a few people have interpreted in a certain way, and that got Mr. Higgs a Nobel Prize. But how has it impacted your life? Maybe it's impacted your life in a way that I don't know.
In ways that I wouldn't be aware of, for sure.
Yeah, okay, so there we are. This is a response to the question of what scientists do and so what scientists unfettered would absolutely do is do exactly that, look for fundamental ideas in science. But the government has put an impediment in front of us. You need money. Mostly you go to the government, and the government has no interest, not by design. They've tried to organize these organizations so that they do promote science, but the model is wrong. So sorry about that. It sounds dogmatic, but
no, that's a good explanation. So tell me how you have managed to do the work that you've been doing in the face of what I can only imagine is some opposition from your colleagues or potentially from the institution where you work.
all of
Has
the
there
above.
been a lot of pushback or not really?
There's been some pushback. So there are two questions. First is the pushback, and the other is where do I get my money? And I have a tendency to forget the first question by answering the second. Please remind me. Okay, pushback, yes, absolutely. There was a guy at my own university, a different department, and this was, in fact, just before the fourth phase book came out. And we had coffee together multiple times. And this guy kept asking me questions about, and I tried to give an answer, but I found that he wasn't listening, that he preferred his own answer, and he would dismiss my answer, not by saying, "Oh, you're wrong," but by launching into a long tirade
Yeah.
about certain principles, and this violated the principles, et cetera, et cetera. So we met several times, and after 3 or 4 times, I said, "Hey, look, it wasn't so interesting for me because it was clear that he really didn't have much interest in finding out whether we're right or not right, because he wasn't interested in my answers." So I suggested to him, "Hey, let's just agree to disagree." 2 years later, he sent me a manuscript like 100 pages long, criticizing what we've done, and it was published, even though there was one reviewer, and he asked me, he said, "Do you know about this manuscript? This guy's from your university. And what do you think about it?" And I said, "No comment, because this is for you to decide. You're the reviewer." He told me later that he rejected the manuscript, but the editor decided to publish it.
Huh.
One reviewer, he rejected it, but they published it.
Yeah.
And then there were 3 or 4 copycat publications that said, "Yeah, this guy is really onto it."
Yeah.
And for me, it was so clear that he was wrong. I just mentioned one thing, not to be defensive, but maybe it sounds defensive. He was talking about a particular polymer called naphion that we used in many of our
Yep.
experiments. And he was dwelling on the particular properties of that, which seemed to me to be awfully complex, what he was describing. And he tried to argue that this is a result of the particular characteristics of naphion. Instead of naphion, we've used 50 different,
I was going to say you use all kinds of different substances in
and
your
we get pretty
experiments.
much the same result with all of us. Anything that's based on naphion, you raise some questions. So yes, thank you for your support. So yeah, and in my own department, I'm still in the department, and I hesitate to say specific things, but I got to tell you that life has been difficult. There are a few people whose toes I'm stepping on, and their toes are fragile.
Yeah.
Okay, and one of them was a person with some power in the department. And for a couple of decades, since I used to be really popular in the department in my previous career studying muscles and muscle contraction. But as soon as I started studying water and we found some interesting things that didn't agree with their point of view,
Yeah.
I blistering attacks.
Yeah.
And they've gone on for some years. And you can imagine if you're in an environment, you have colleagues and friends and such, and they start avoiding you, suddenly too busy to have lunch,
Yeah.
et cetera, et cetera. Yes. So that was your first question. I did remember the second question, which was really your first question. How do you get funding? And the answer used to be through the same organizations that we've been talking about, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health. And I'm not sure why I was successful. Maybe clear writing, or maybe having friends. My students did pretty well, and they became reviewers, and it depends who you know sometimes. And so I was pretty lucky. And I actually managed to get, maybe I'll skip this because you have other questions. I know, and I want to use it all the time. But lately, in the past decade or so, I've had to rely on private funds, and they're not easy to get. In fact, in in one case, this billionaire guy came to me. He said, "I've read your fourth phase book, and I like it, and I'm going to fund you." And
Wow.
he said, "I'm going to fund you for the rest of your career, no matter what you do." And so thank you very much. And he did handsomely. He said, "I'm going to fund you indefinitely unless I run into a financial problem." He did run into a financial problem. So it was, I think, 4 or 5 years. And he gave me a year's notice. He said, I'm retired. Decided to retire. And the money that I was able to get from my company, I was using to pay you. The rest of my money is in very large investments of some sort. I don't know which ones, maybe
Yeah.
a tall building or, yeah, that sort of thing. And he said, "I can't easily sell those." Or the way he put it, nobody wants to buy
Yeah.
them. So he gave me a year's notice, and now he's trying to help me get funding from other people, which I really treasure. So right now I do have some funding from a second guy who reached out in the same way as the first one, a modest amount of funding. And a third guy who I met at a conference, and a real treasure, a guy who I met, and I didn't know who he was at the conference. We became friends, and when he heard my presentation, he said, we should collaborate. So I said, we don't have much money. He said, oh, money's no problem. He said, I have a foundation. So it turns out he does have a foundation, and he's quite wealthy. His name is Federico Fagin, and he invented the microprocessor.
Wow.
So he has, I wouldn't say infinite money, but,
Yeah.
so
He's doing okay. Yeah.
he's doing okay. Anyway, I better shut up about this because I can see that we're going to run out of time if I keep going.
This is all fascinating. Maybe we should say a few words specifically about what have been the most controversial elements of what you've published about. I know what interests me most specifically, but I'm not going to take over the conversation. What, from your point of view, what are the most controversial points that put you in the way of people who find this disagreeable or threatening or contrary to everything that they think is true?
It's difficult to answer that question because right now the interest in this is really soaring. At first, not, but you've seen the reviews of that fourth phase book, and it's 4.9 out of 5 stars. So people who read it like it, and there's a huge cohort now of people who are mostly in the field of natural health, alternative health, homeopathy, who know about the book and like the book, as far as I can see, based on the reviews and feedback that I get and invitations for podcasts and such. So it's going extremely well. There aren't too many people. I guess that I'm trying to answer your question. The people who, as I said, there are a handful of papers, and they talk mostly about Naphion, and so I don't take them so seriously. But others, they're not necessarily critical, but they hold back. And these are the people who you might say are in biophysics, who have learned about and think they understand everything they need to know about water. But they haven't been very vocal. At least I haven't seen a whole lot of challenges. Right now, we have so much evidence, so many papers and reports and such, and followers. And people, for example, who are not in the field of water, but who use water, like one guy builds Olympic ice skating rinks. And he found out about infrared energy, building easy water, which sits at the top of the ice. And of course, wants the ice skating rinks, the ice to be as smooth as possible. So he wrote a book on the subject, and the book centers a lot on stuff. People who are now working in reverse osmosis, who think that easy water has something to do with this process. So what I'm getting at is it's been attractive not only to people in natural health, all areas of natural health, but also in people who use water indirectly and find what we've reported to be useful. The people who object, maybe I should open my eyes more widely, but I haven't seen any, how shall I say, any papers that have caused me to rethink this stuff. It just builds and builds. So maybe I hope I'm not misrepresenting the actual case, but I haven't seen much in the way of objections.
Yeah.
Serious.
And I can just say, in my experience as someone who has had to engage over many years with the incredulity of people around how water could contain information or transmit information, and how that's just one of those things that's impossible. And so we shouldn't talk about it. We shouldn't research it. We shouldn't stick our necks out with it and hypothesize about a mechanism for how that's done. You don't see opposing theories. You mostly see people publishing things which are actually just a kind of cynical or mockery, or just saying, why would anybody even think to ask these kind of questions when this is so ridiculous? And I always ask myself, why is this so hard to believe about water when nobody has a problem with the idea that ordinary beach sand is running their computer? Like they have no problem with sand as a storage and transmission mechanism for information. They have no problem with sand being the thing, but somehow water is off the table. It's out of the question. It's
Um,
strange.
no, I agree with you. It's strange. And there are a lot of people who just won't listen to anything you have to say. If you tell them that, it can't be a placebo effect because it's used on horses and dogs and
And
those
plants.
plants. Yeah. And they don't, at least it's not obvious that the placebo effect could work, although you never know.
Yeah. Why is it, Dr. Pollack, when they do see things that almost could be scientific truth, and they always bring up the word placebo? For example, Tracy's big into Bach flowers and how that's shown the healing process. Why is it, unless it's completely the whole scientific community agrees with something, does it become more likely to be mainstream than only a few?
I think one of the possible answers is that we don't like to be disgraced by our colleagues. You're thinking, what? It's impossible. And then they begin to think you're a crackpot and a weirdo, and they stay away from you, and they don't want to be associated with you, because if they are associated with you, then they will get the same label that you have. Oh, you think that way too. So scientists these days, especially, have become conservative. And it's not just scientists, but others as well. The general populace, they stick with the popular view because they're not going to lose friends that way. They're not going to lose respect that way. And everybody wants to be respected, and everybody wants to have friends. So I think this is a large part of it. We feel secure when we think we know something. We have a body of knowledge, and sits in a box, and someone punctures the balloon or breaches the side of the box, and we feel uneasy. We feel uncomfortable because what we thought we knew is being challenged, and we'd rather reject the challenge and say, and wait to see what other people finally think, and preserve their points of view. So it's a kind of natural conservatism. And the process of science needs to, I think, battle against that, because
This is
that's the
very
point.
much,
Yeah.
it's very much like what you say in your book that the emperor has no clothes. You're
Right.
somebody who is prepared to stand in the marketplace and say that. And
I'm not sure why, but there's something about finding truth for
yeah,
me. And I don't know that I found truth, but I'm trying to find truth. That there's a kind of urgency about that I feel. And I, this urgency, I've got lots of ideas about nature and how it works. And I only need to have time to write all the books. I've got four
yeah,
of them on the agenda
wow.
that are either fully written or partly written. And the limiting factor is my son, who's my artist, who illustrated the book that you showed, and
Oh, nice.
he's fantastic. And next
Yeah,
book,
yeah.
yeah, and the artwork is even better in the next book, because I told him, Ethan, you contributed so much that your name should be on the cover of the book. And so next book, his name is on the cover, and because his name is on the cover, he's working extra hard to make sure that every single illustration is just right, which takes time.
Very nice.
Yeah.
Very nice. So let me just, if I may, talk about some of the aspects of your this book that I read, The Fourth Phase of Water, that appeal to me from the work that I'm doing. And it has to do with the mechanism of storing and potentially transmitting information.
Yeah.
One of them being this liquid crystalline structure that
Right.
is this easy exclusion zone water. So maybe you could speak to or hypothesize about how this liquid crystalline structure could potentially function in a similar way to what I was just talking about, basic beach sand, which is purified into silicon dioxide, and the crystals are somehow elemental in the storage and transmission of information.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a great question. And I think there is a basis. So if you, first of all, if you hypothesize that liquid water stores information, starting even before that, there is ample evidence now from many quarters that water can store information. And of course, the homeopathic process is a good example of that, but there are other examples. And at the conference on water, we or I run the International Annual Conference on the Physics, Chemistry, and Biology of Water each year. And each year we have presenters that talk about information or memory of water. And so where is the water? Now, if the information can't be stored in liquid water, what other kind of water is there? And that is EZ water, fourth phase water, the liquid crystalline water that you mentioned that we were able to identify. So if you ask the question, is it possible that information can be stored in EZ water? The way we approach it is to say, we know that computer memory consists of transistors, silicon, there you go, a two-dimensional array. So you have your memory stick that you can stick in. What's inside? Inside is a planar array of silicon transistors organized in a regular grid. Okay, and there are two features of this that are important. The first is the grid is regular, okay, a regular array. And secondly, each transistor has two states, 0, 1, on, off, whatever. And the memory is reflected in the distribution of states over those that two-dimensional plane. Okay, so you ask the question, is EZ water similar? Are there any similarities to what exists and what we know can store information? Because then maybe EZ water can store information. So the first is regularity, and so you've got this two-dimensional plane in the computer memory. Is there something similar in the EZ? EZ consists of a stack of planes, and each plane has a honeycomb motif or honeycomb arrangement. So things are laid out, and not laid out in a rectilinear grid, but a honeycomb, a hexagonal grid. So essentially, that's pretty much the same. And then can any of either the hydrogen or the oxygen have two states? Hydrogen appears not to, but oxygen actually has 5 states, 5 oxidation states or charge states, ranging from the most commonly referred to one is -2. We call it the valence of -2, but there's also -1, and there's 0, and +1 and +2. So it means that the two criteria, or the two bases for computer memory, also exist in EZ water. And it's even, how should I say, yeah, more ideal for this sort of thing, because there are 5 states, not 2 states. And also, the oxygens and hydrogens are packed so close together compared to transistors that we computed once that if it really turns out that EZ is the correct, EZ water is the correct substrate for storing information in nature, that the information density is so high that you'll eventually be able to put a computer on a pinhead, an entire computer. Yeah.
So interesting.
It's interesting, and I
because it's interesting for me also because one drop of whatever medicine we're talking about, if it's homeopathy or this happens to be a Bach flower essence, but like one drop is enough. And that's something incredible for many people to believe. But if, as you're saying, one drop is capable of holding orders of magnitude more information than you need even to do the job.
Yes, it does. And even we have some idea about why it's necessary to shake the succussion process. And I'm not sure if you're aware of the work of Alexander Konovalov from Russia, who passed a few years ago. He was a really famous scientist in Russia. He was the head of, in Kazan in Russia, he was the head of a chemical institute. Then he became rector, president of his university for 11 years. And when all the rectors of the universities went to Gorbachev to say, hey, our salaries are like $30 a month, you got to do something about that, he was chosen among all the rectors to be the one to speak to.
Wonderful. What an honor.
Then, in his last years, he studied high dilutions.
Cool.
Yeah, and not a homeopath, but as a chemist, he wanted to know what really happens when you do high dilutions. And for any homeopaths who are listening to this or watching, I highly recommend his work. A good deal of it is in English.
Yeah.
Konovalov, Alexander Konovalov. His works are amazing. One of the things that he found is that if you don't do the succussion stage, it won't work at all. He also found if you block the energy coming in from the environment, it won't work either.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, and I want to discuss with him, but unfortunately he had the temerity to die before I had a chance. A wonderful guy. So what about the succussion? If easy water is involved, if you shake it, the easy water breaks up into a lot of little clumps of
Right.
easy. We found that experimentally when we pick up a chamber that has easy and we shake it, not purposefully shake it, but we move it without being really careful. The easy breaks up and then it reforms again. So when you do succussion, it's like a really
Yeah.
sharp, you break up the easy, which contains the information, and you got a lot of little packets of information. So when you dilute it 100 times or
They're like holographic or something then.
well, there you've got little packets of
Yeah.
information, and so they persist. So you can do this an infinite number of times, and you'll still have information. And I think this is a hypothesis. That's the reason why the information persists, no matter how many times you dilute, even though you have, in theory, you have pure water, but the water contains information.
Bravo. That's wonderful to hear. So I want to run this by you and you tell me what you think. But this form of therapeutic agent that I'm talking about, Bach flower essences, these were made in the 1930s originally by a man who had been a biochemist and Dr. Edward Bach in England. He got famous as a biochemist for doing purified microbiome stuff that he was injectables made from purified stool samples, essentially, for curing chronic disease, which was a pretty interesting thing. There's still really no medical cure for chronic disease. But back in the day, he became very famous for that. And after a while, by chance, something happened at his university hospital and he had to move to another job. And randomly, he got hired by the Royal London Homeopathic Hospital, knowing nothing about homeopathy, but they needed a biochemist, bioengineer. And he went to work there and learned about homeopathy and said, this would be interesting if my system could be transferred so that I didn't have to do injections anymore, because he knew instinctively somehow that injection wasn't a friendly way to introduce a healing substance into the body. So he did that and got famous all over again for a piece of homeopathy, which is still used very much today, known as the Bach-Patterson nosodes. And after that, he just decided that, and he didn't want to work with any kind of toxic original substance anymore, and that there were some healing agents out in the world that were of the highest purity, and that he was going to go out and look for them. And he started with flowers. And instinctively, somehow, just through his intuition, he started trying out not eating the flowers, but putting the dew drops on his tongue of different flowers that he would encounter at the right time of day when there was dew on the petals. And he felt that it was very clear to him the effect on him that these things were having on a kind of emotional, psychic level. And after a while, obviously, this was not a scalable enterprise. You couldn't have thousands of people out collecting dewdrops in little bottles. So what he tried was, first of all, he realized that the dew was different on flower petals that were in the sunlight and those that were in the shade. There was an appreciable difference for him in the effect that these things had.
I mean,
So his methodology,
in the sunshine, they were more effective.
yes,
Yes. Okay.
that's not a surprise to you.
No.
So his system was to take pure spring water or river water close to where the flowers were growing. Most of these are tree flowers, by the way. Maybe half of them are tree flowers. They're not, so many are just ornamentals. They're trees and bushes. He would collect a handful of petals and put them in a glass bowl of pure water in the sunlight for 3 or 4 hours,
Yeah.
and then strain away the plant material. And that was the medicine. So for me, reading your book, I understand all of the steps of that. There is the hydrophilic surface, there is the absorption of radiant energy from the sun, and there is the easy water, which is storing effectively, indefinitely, the information. He would add some brandy or alcohol to the water so that it wouldn't spoil in terms of growing germs.
Well,
And
absolutely. It all makes complete sense. And I'd heard about the Bach flowers, but I didn't I haven't heard the story and the details that you're providing. So interesting.
Isn't
Absolutely.
that cool?
Yeah.
So for me, it's not just a revelation because what can I say? It's a revelation to have an articulation of the science behind why this works and how it can be so easy to understand. It's easy to understand. And his method, he wanted it to be easy and simple. And that is so in line with what you were talking about, that nature prefers simplicity. And the easiest way is probably the best way.
Yeah, and it's an easy way and it's an easy way.
See, exactly.
Oh, the two are largely the same. It's so interesting. He's not related somehow to Johann Sebastian.
It would be humorous if he were, and possibly there's a family connection. There's about 200 years.
Yeah.
Certainly, Johann Sebastian was a very prolific father, so there must be a lot of descendants around. But
Yeah.
this gentleman pronounced his name Bach for
Oh, Bach.
reasons that I don't
Oh.
understand. But he was Welsh, and he was known to pronounce it Bach. So there are people all over the world who say it in both different ways. I can't bring myself to do that because I was a musician for so many years. I used to play in symphony orchestra. So
What
for me,
instrument?
Bach is Bach.
What did you play? What instrument?
The viola. I played
Oh,
viola in symphony orchestra for about 25 years.
Oh, I see. So you've played practically everything that's Bach, from Brandenburg concertos onto whatever.
Everything. Yes, everything, except not the organ music, because that's not my thing. But
I can guess.
even the Goldberg variations has been transcribed for orchestra, so I've even played that. But
I prefer it on piano.
yeah, me too.
Or harpsichord. Yeah,
Me
sure.
too.
Yeah. I've got a harpsichord actually in my
No
living room.
way.
I built it many years ago.
What?
Yeah, it was a kit. We were playing recorders and we needed a harpsichord to go with it, so I decided to build it.
You said, wait right here. I'll be right back. And you
300
threw
hours
together a
later.
harpsichord.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Oh, that's fantastic.
yeah, it works. But anyway, back to the subject at hand, because I know you've got a list of questions, I think.
I'm so interested in everything that you wrote, but this is a book about the social behavior of water. And
Yeah.
what people think they know about water is based on the molecular structure of it and I don't know, maybe the properties of it. But the idea that water molecules could have a kind of social behavior is new idea. And again, I'm going to say I don't know why it should be so revolutionary when we have long understood that proteins are the same constituent enzymes folded up into different shapes that give them their particular properties. And nobody has a problem with that. But somehow the idea that molecules can behave, water molecules can behave in a characteristic way that give them certain properties, that's a revolutionary idea.
Yeah, maybe the most revolutionary is that by doing so, the water itself can store energy. That for me, it blows my mind, because so what we found is that if you have a hydrophilic surface, that is a surface that likes water, as opposed to like Teflon that doesn't like water, that's hydrophobic. If you have that and you have infrared energy, which is all over the place, it's quite abundant, then from liquid water like this, easy water forms. And we found it has a negative charge, and the region just beyond the easy has a positive charge. When you've got negative and positive separated from one another, you've got a battery. And we have proof of principle that this battery supplies energy, because if you take two electrodes and you put one in the easy and one in the positive region beyond, you can get current that flows, and you could light, for example, light an LED. I think that provides clear evidence that this is really true.
Who can argue with that?
I don't think anybody. I haven't counted too many arguments.
They just don't like it. They don't actually argue with it. They just don't like it.
I think they don't like it. But if you can imagine, if this process is efficient, you can scale it up and provide energy for a city.
Yeah.
And unlike solar cells, you don't have to deplete the earth of its valuable resources. You don't have to wait until the sun shines, because infrared energy is all over all the time. That's why At night, the military uses it to check out the enemy tanks and such. You can get a
Yeah.
beautiful image of everything, pretty much. If you turn out all the lights in your studio, I could make out with an infrared camera everything, you and your earrings and the
Yeah.
sloping roof and the planks that form your roof, et cetera, et cetera. So everything is there. And if it's efficient, imagine the scale up. And we just haven't had the funds to investigate this, but it's just waiting for,
It is just waiting.
yeah, it might turn out to be a red herring. Maybe it's grossly inefficient and it won't work.
And once again, there are people heavily invested in there not being a basically free, unlimited resource that
Yeah.
would put them out of business in all the various industries, not just oil and gas,
Oh,
coal,
yeah.
whatever, but wind and solar would be, you'd be competing against traditional kind of green energy sources as well. So that unfortunately, so many people are invested in there not being.
You understand that better than anybody, being in the homeopathic
Yeah.
arena. Yeah, there are lots of people who don't want to see this being real.
Yeah.
And you feel it. I understand in Europe, they're having a hard time in certain countries. There's a lot of pressure against homeopathic practices.
Oh, a lot of pressure in Canada and the US as well. Yeah. So, and there's no argument against it, but there are a lot of people speaking against it from the platform or from the foundation that it's a ridiculous idea. And anyone who talks about it is by definition a fool.
Yeah.
And that's the whole argument. That's the whole argument. And it doesn't seem to matter how many medical doctors, PhD scientists, doesn't matter how many, there are hospitals all over the world that use homeopathic medicine. There are large scale experiments happening in Cuba with homeopathy, which is one of the only places in the world where they can do those kind of things because they are not beholden to the pharmaceutical industry, to the global pharmaceutical industry. The industry that they have there belongs to the state, and they are looking for the cheapest, best answer for their population. So they've done very large scale experiments there. But the world is invested in there not being basically free solutions to healthcare problems.
It applies in so many arenas of life that the bottom line is the dollar or the euro or whatever currency you have in mind. Yeah, absolutely.
This has been extraordinary for me. I thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. And yeah, I really enjoyed your questions and your direction. And thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you once again. And how might anyone contact you who's wanting to get in touch with you after hearing this?
My email is all over. It's easy to find.
Okay. All right. I'll put it also in the show notes.
Sure. Yeah. It's becoming difficult for me to respond to all of them. I really try hard.
I'm so grateful that you got back to me. This is wonderful.
I'm glad to make your acquaintance. Where are you
Thanks
situated?
again.
Where are you situated?
I'm in Canada, not too far from Toronto. I'm a couple hours north of Toronto, where I am right now.
Oh, okay. I won't make a comment about Canada and US regarding political issues. Leave that for somebody else.
All right.
Okay,
Fantastic. And TracyPoizner.com. People can go check that out for the people listening to the simulcast. And that was a special simulcast of the Neil Haley Show and Limitless Podcast, guys. Take care.